Good afternoon, and here is like my fourth try to get the audio to record on this presentation. So this is my Antonia Book 4. This replaces the lecture that you were going to have in class. And really what I focus on is how you put the pieces together in Antonia's story, Larry Donovan, Jim Burden, Tiny Solderball, and all of them. So make sure you take notes on this presentation, and that way you can use it to move forward. So good morning. I bet you missed me today while I was away at a doctor's appointment and you were playing Quizlet Live, making sure you could review all of your content. Well, here is the lecture that you missed because I was out today. Really what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the major elements of Book 4. So what do I have here? I have my copy of Antonia. I've got my copies of notes that I took today on the material. And we should go forward and absolutely kind of keep all this in mind. So the major theme of the novel has been the effect of nostalgia on the major characters and how it either kind of motivates them to move forward or it hinders them. In most cases, it's hindering. Jim Burden is hindered. Antonia, to an extent in Book 4, falls victim to the fact that she is, in fact, an immigrant woman and she doesn't fit in, especially with that whole incident with Larry Donovan. So she's crushed by those elements in 4. Jim, kind of the selfish guy that he is, it seems that he rejoices just a little bit at her suffering and that she didn't move on successfully from him, even though he's moved from Lincoln off to the next level. So I'm actually in the text, and I think this is important for us as we go through. So in the first paragraph on page 141 in this version of the book, it says, everything seemed just as it used to be. My grandparents looked very little older. Frances Harling was married now, and she and her husband managed the Harlings' interests in Blackhawk. How convenient for Jim. He returns from being away, and the world that he knows has changed very little. He seems to struggle immensely from the fact that he can't grow, and the fact that the world is the same is hugely significant, I think, to him. And I also believe it's a crutch to his character. When he comes home in Book 1 of the Pioneer Woman's story, and the Pioneer Woman's story is Antonia's story, where we fill in all the background. The first thing that he learned, the first thing that he says is, poor Antonia. Everyone would be saying that now, I thought bitterly. I replied that grandmother had written me how Antonia went away to marry Larry Donovan at some place where he was working, that he had deserted her, and there was now a baby. That was all I knew. But for Jim, this is all he needs to know, because now he wasn't there to save her. He's not the knight in shining armor. So for him, I think I see two things here. One, he feels bad, not bad enough, but bad that he left. And two, he's got this little bit of pride that it fell apart for Antonia because she didn't pick him. And I think that's very significant. If I move on with 141 and going on to the top of 142, we just continue to hear the story. We learn of the other characters, Tiny and Lena. You get a lot of information about Tiny on 142. If I go to that second full paragraph on 142, we get Tiny's story. She's a success story. Lena in Book 3 was a success story. This is contrast with Antonia, who never left really to explore her potential. Very big deal. And her affair, if you call it that, with Larry Donovan sets her back even more. So Antonia illustrates the struggles of an immigrant woman. When I thought about it, I discovered that I had never known Tiny as well as I knew the other girls. I remember her tripping briskly, sorry am I talking, about the dining room on her high heels carrying a big tray full of dishes, remembering when they were younger. Again, here's an example of Jim's nostalgia. In that third paragraph, this is what actually happened to Tiny. While she was running her lodging home in Seattle, gold was discovered in Alaska. Miners and sailors came back from the north with wonderful stories and pouches of gold. Tiny saw it. She becomes absolutely enthralled with the idea of adventure, self-actualizing, which is a word that you know, and kind of being an adventurous girl. The same thing that Lena did. The exact opposite of what Antonia does. And very specifically, the opposite of what Jim does at any point in this story. So I think that's why Tiny's story about moving to the Klondike fields on the last steamer that went up the Yukon before it froze for the winter is significant. Now I'm reading off of 142, the last big paragraph on that page. But I think Tiny is another example of a pioneer woman who strikes out and does something. If I move to 143, and this is the first full paragraph. After 10 years in the Klondike, Tiny returned with a considerable fortune to live in San Francisco. I met her in Salt Lake in 1908. She was a thin, hard-faced woman, very well dressed, very reserved in manner. Curiously enough, she reminded me of Mrs. Gardner, for whom she had worked in Blackhawk. Jim sees Tiny after a long time away. She has changed, grown, all those things, but he still connects her to those early memories. So still, in Book 4, Jim really hasn't achieved what he needs to move on with his life. So I think there's a lot happening here in regards to potential for character development. If I move to the last paragraph of 143, Tiny limped slightly when she walked. The claim on Hunter Creek took the toll from its possessors. Tiny had been caught in a sudden turn of weather like poor Johnson. She lost 3 toes from one of those pretty little feet that used to trip up Black Hawk in pointed slippers. Notice the description. Tiny goes off to Alaska to make it rich and to be successful. She loses toes and all those kinds of things. She lives the life. Jim still sees her as that child who runs around in high heels, pretending dress up, all of that. Jim is still hindered. Now, if I continue through that paragraph, I go to the last 3 lines. She was satisfied with her success, but not elated. She was like someone in whom the faculty of becoming interested is worn out. What an interesting line. Jim's observation is that Tiny is the type of character who has become worn out, that she's not important to be interested in anymore. And I think that's really kind of an important idea. Jim is losing interest in everybody from his past, even Antonia. And again, I think that's really significant as we look at what's going on. So I'm going to take you over to a slide here just to remind you about the things that you need in your notes. So here we are back to this title slide from the presentation. But really what I want you to be able to look at are these next slides. So we talk about realism traits, even spelled it right there at the top of the page. So this reminds us that realism renders reality closely in comprehensive detail. You need to find examples of this and be able to talk about it intelligently in Book 4. Character is more important than action and plot. We only empathize with Antonia because of all the character work we did in Books 1 through 3. And also because of the character work we did with Lena and Tiny, and probably Gaston, Cleric, and Wick Cutter. Character is more important than action and plot. Characters appear in their real complexity of temperament and motive. I would expect that given a quiz on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving that you could absolutely provide examples of these major traits as we go through the presentation. The last 3 events are usually plausible. The novels avoid the sensational, dramatic elements of naturalistic novels and romances. So everything has to happen for a reason. Antonia becomes pregnant, unmarried. Jim kind of ditches her and then chases after the women that are more attractive. The Lenas and the Tiny Soderballs. But then he seems to have an epiphany by the end of Book 4, Chapter 4, and it becomes more significant. So as I look at these traits, I think they are guiding for the way we're looking at the material in Antonia. And I think this sets us up for the next piece where I transition into another little picture of me. Okay, now that I am back from that that PowerPoint with the characteristics of realism, I wanted to just kind of read through my notes and see that, and give you the things that I wrote about book 1. So if I look, Jim returns. His nostalgia can be problematic for him in book 4. Still very much frozen in time at the beginning of book 4. Antonia has been struck by tragedy. This sort of reflects the immigrant struggle and why that's so significant in the novel. She has the shame from the affair with Larry Donovan. She has a baby. She's unmarried. All the stigma that comes with those things. And it seems that Jim loses his romantic idea of Antonia at this point. These things have to happen, I think, in the novel. Jim has to be able to shed Antonia. I think that occurs here in book 4. But it does show me that Jim is fairly shallow. He says on page 148, I think it is, that he was bitterly disappointed in Antonia. Now, number one, what gives him the right to be bitterly disappointed other than his pompous, overly educated attitude? But also, why is he so hung up on the fact that Antonia has these issues? So I think this is very important, that Jim is probably shallow. We also learn in book 4, chapter 1, that Lena is the only successful immigrant. Tiny, she's described as being too manly, not womanly. I find this significant that Lena, who Jim falls madly in love with, gets this sort of authentic, beautiful woman in Lena, but those that have to go out and work for it are described as being manly. But even though Jim finds Tiny unattractive, I think her quest certainly motivates Jim. He fixates on her as a character in book 4, chapter 1. And he seems to constantly, or at least present it to us in a way, that we compare Tiny Soderball to Antonia. So I think that's very important. Now, if I take a look at chapter 2, the shock of book 2 is the idea of Antonia's baby. Oh my God, everything was perfect for 140-some pages. Then Antonia falls in love, makes a dumb decision, and ends up with a baby, really forever destroying her opportunity to go out and become a Lena or to become a Tiny. And it's very emotionally crushing to Jim because he had Antonia on this pedestal the entire novel, and all of a sudden she makes a boo-boo, even though Jim hasn't made any in the course of the novel. See my face on this one? I'm saying Jim has made lots of mistakes, and see, that's why he's not a good character to judge. So Antonia has this baby. She becomes unable to sort of achieve the American dream and become a successful immigrant. So this is a huge thing. I find it very interesting. The shock of book 2 is Antonia's baby. It is emotionally crushing to Jim that, one, she moved on without him. She didn't need him in the course of this story. It shows Jim to be a hugely selfish character, and as a result of being a selfish character, he can't move on. Ooh, do you see that? So if he can't move on, he's still crippled, and this novel can't move. I think also he criticizes her for the guilt that she has. He says he could not forgive her, he told himself, if she hadn't thrown herself away for such a cheap fellow. So now Jim is the win. He's the guy that's of greatest value, and Larry Donovan, yeah, we know Larry Donovan is bad, but come on. Jim is going to sit and judge Antonia for her behavior. I'm having a hard time with Jim's ability to certainly see all these kinds of things. We learn here about Larry Donovan. So if I look at some of the descriptions of Larry Donovan in book 2, now this is on 144, the 4th paragraph. Larry Donovan was a passenger conductor on one of those train crew aristocrats who are always afraid that someone may ask them to put up a car window, and who, if requested to perform such a menial service, silently point to the button that calls the porter. He doesn't want to be responsible. He doesn't want to take sort of any desire or to be helpful or any of those kinds of things. And I think this is really important because Larry refuses to do anything, almost like Jim through book 4. Jim has to have his epiphany. I think Larry Donovan is a comparison that shows us what Jim has to be able to achieve. And for me, that was in that 4th paragraph on 144. If I skip over to 145, look also at the comparison. He goes and sees Mrs. Harling, and he learns about Charlie, who again has become successful. Charlie was off in the battleship cruising somewhere on the Caribbean Sea. I turned in at the gate. It was like a feeling of pleasure that I opened and shut that gate in those days. I liked the feel of it under my hand. I liked the way it used to be, not the way it is now and what I'm looking to do. So I think this is significant in our understanding of how Jim now is coming face to face with some of his major issues. Now, for the sake of time, because I don't want this to be too long, I'm going to skip over to chapter 4. And the reason why I want to skip over to chapter 4 is because I want to make sure that I get you to some specific ideas. Now, I'm going to analyze book 4, but look at the big stuff that happens in book 3. Ambrose drives Antonia to the train. It's ironic that it happens in spring. I would say, why is it important that Ambrose kind of takes Antonia off to the next phase? Antonia leaves home on page 147, returns unmarried, shamed, broken on page 148. Specifically the last paragraph of 148. On 149, Antonia loses her beauty. And if I look at page 149, there's a lot of stuff that I think is going on. For example, if I go to the second paragraph, and this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom of that paragraph. She was afflicted with toothache, one tooth after another, ulcerated, and she went about with her face swollen half the time. She gets normal, sort of on the plains issues, but it deteriorates her beauty for Jim. So I think this third chapter, or this third book of the Pioneer Woman's story is gigantic. 149, she loses her beauty. Page 150, despite all of this, there is a glimmer of hope, and Antonia is independent, despite the fact that she's not this beautiful person anymore, or at least in Jim's eyes. So from on page 150, I am third full paragraph, on the page. That very night it happened. She got her cattle home, turned them into the corral, and went into the house, into her room behind the kitchen, and shut the door. There, without calling to anybody, without a groan, she lay down in the bed and bore her child. Far more independent and strong than anybody else in the story. So I think, again, this is of great value for us. Book 4 of the Pioneer Woman's story gets us to some very significant elements. I'm reaching over here, and you just saw me take my notes. So in book 4, there's a lot going on. Antonia, although worn down by her own life, still maintains some strength. And the line that I go to is in the third paragraph actually. But there was a kind of strength in the gravity of her face. And I underline this because it was important. And her color still gave her that look of deep-seated health and ardor. She was barely 24 years old. So Antonia has lived a full lifetime, had enough struggle in her short 24 years that is making her old. It's stripping that romantic beauty away and making it something much more significant. I just looked at my timer, and this segment is 9:48 at the moment, so I'm going to bring it to a close in the next couple. So it goes on, and it talks in Chapter 4 about how Gaston Cleric dies. The one that was Jim's guiding force has now passed on, and Jim is forced to do this on his own. So, very important. Also notice that here in Part 4, or Chapter 4, Jim is reminded of the red grass. He's reminded of the crossroads in Mr. Schmerda. This is all the power of memory that comes back to Jim when he's around Antonia. That's a theme. That's a theme. He also talks of Cleric's death, of pneumonia, his friends, and Cleric's hopes. So Jim is maybe starting to look beyond himself at something a little bit bigger to keep him moving. So there's a lot of information here in Chapter 4. There's probably some good quotes that you can pull out. So this is the lecture that I want you to pay attention to as we move into Thanksgiving break and as we get all these things done. Okay? So there will be a last segment on here that kind of gives you the details that I want you to have as a takeaway. If you can do that, you're going to be in great shape for Tuesday's class and moving on.